Здравствуйте, уважаемая Людмила Михайловна и все, кто меня смотрит сейчас. Я должен сказать о дате. Значит, 23 февраля, четверг, время 22 часа 26 минут. Я приступил к третьему сегодняшнему файлу. Работы немного, потому что все мне понятно, известно. Сейчас скажу небольшую преамбулу. Значит, в чем тут дело? Я жил некоторое время при живом Альберте Эйнштейне. В 60-х, 70-х годах была страшная популярность, я это помню. Я интересовался этим вопросом физики, покупал книжки, читал. Все. Я был релятивистом по убеждению, ну там класс какой-то, там 5, 6, 8, 9, все. Были другие, конечно, дела, но это тоже. Она мне интересовала, релятивистская теория. Были кумиры, были такие серьезные академики, которые вот разбирались в этом всем. И я, конечно, во всех этих книжках, например, книга Фока, академика нашего, я разбирал ее, там, скажем, Лагунов и так далее. Очень там все физики были просто в восторге. Потом уже в 21 веке, после 2000-х годов, и даже раньше там все это, взлетела звезда Кипа Торна. Я посвятил ему тоже много места. Он тоже считается большим теоретиком, знатоком и так далее, и так далее. Я вижу, как этот человек создавал теорию, там писал книги со своими покровителями, которые общались с Эйнштейном. Писал я эту историю, и вы там это знаете. Кому это интересно, найдет в моих роликах и так далее. И я сейчас наблюдаю следующее поколение. Он человек не молодой тоже, возраста я что-то сомневаюсь, наверное, моего, там, так примерно. Но он все иначе воспринимает. Я имею в виду Торнхилла. Торнхилл. И Торн, тут легко запомнить. Значит, я записал тоже позавчера в интернете большое интервью. Я его укоротил и сейчас хочу вам его прокрутить. То же самое, та же история. Там будет на английском перевод русский, понять все можно. Можно понять. Я не знаю, тут у меня вопросов нет никаких, я понимаю. В чем тут дело? Почему он мне так интересен? Во-первых, это ведущий, там один, как я говорил, мифотворец, очень слишком замкнут на мистику, на эзотерику, в общем. А он больше физик. По крайней мере, он пишет, говорит, выступает с лекциями, очень много у него лекций. Я его слушал, много, достаточно я так. А эта лекция меня поразила. Она довольно, его спрашивают, она отвечает, и довольно она такая компактная, и он дает свое видение мира, и, естественно, своей теории там развернуто. И потом, конечно, приходит к этим своим к мифам. Он верит в всю эту ерунду, в которую я не подчиняюсь абсолютно, а предельно рационально. То есть, нет, меня не переубедить, там, Бог, какие-то такие потусторонние силы, какие-то, в общем, этих самых нелепиц тоже полно и разновидностей, разбираться, говорить, характеризовать их невозможно. Я понимаю, о чем, ему прощаю, говорю, что ладно, что дальше там у тебя. Он неплохой, контакты там, я не знаю, где он, в Америке у нас живет, значит, у него хорошая база такая. Я начал, когда мне этот парнишка, я его благодарил, он мне показал фильм, с Марсом связано. Вот. Хороший кадр. И я вот так вот, значит, привык. Мы отодвигаем в сторону все вот эти его заходы с мифотворчеством, с мифами и сказками другого рода. Значит, и смотрим, что он это самое. Я буду говорить об этом. И другие там товарищи тоже говорят об этом. Так, это я все понимаю. Я хочу вот что еще сказать. Смотрите, это уже у меня 9-е продолжение вот этой новой строения. Я не хочу думать над тем, как мне назвать. Это всегда ломает голову, как мне назвать. Вот его имя, а что оно говорит. Вот это смотрите. Там идея, это, мой оппонент, не сказать, что он какой-то там, как Эйнштейн. Эйнштейн это самое, такой без Бога в голове, что ли. Я его очень низко ценю с точки зрения человеческих качеств. А Торнхилл человек такой честный, говорит правду, не хитрит. Так, вот это, значит, продолжение 9, не хочу думать. И у меня проблема это с заполнением, вот раньше было тесто, я сочинял, тормозил на недели, там это все уходило на месяцы, сочинял это самое. Тексты какие-то преамбулы, сейчас обленился, не хочу, мне надо высказаться. Я сейчас ищу, много надо вот об этом, об этой самой новой, у меня уже есть материал, надо все-таки его приводить в порядок немножко, хотя есть и просто старые темы, например, не буду думать над примерами, вот. Тут паренек тоже, он у нас живет в России, он тут уже 2 фильма сделал, я его смотрю. Это связано с темной материей. Я сделаю. В этой же будет какое-нибудь продолжение, там номер придумаем когда-то. Да, может быть, его пустить. Вот это будет 10-е, может быть, продолжение. Интересно, он там делает обзор грамотный и такой, будет любопытно. Пусть будет здесь, сейчас пока, наверное, менять ничего не буду. Ничего. Придумывать тексты, информировать, что там делать. Я хочу письма, может быть, то, что мне вот сейчас дает этот парень, Антон, кажется, его зовут, чтобы это самое, вот приведу его, и все, достаточно. То есть то, что дало толчок мне. А вот так вот какие-то обдумывать тексты не хочу, не буду. Так, ладно, Торнхилл. Имя я не выговорю, кажется, Вал, там это сокращенно, а полный не буду смотреть, где-то есть. Так, что я еще забыл? Так, еще минуточку. Значит, я сейчас буду представлять вот это интервью. Человек, который задает вопросы Торнхиллу, вот он, фотография. Он говорит с ним по телефону, наверное, Короче говоря, Торнхилла показывают портрет, показываю вам его, вот он, этот портрет. Здесь дается адрес, где можно будет, значит, это журналист, корреспондент фирмы какой-то. Может, они живут в разных, разных городах. Значит, вот он берет у него интервью, Торнхилла нету, вот так портрет, это, я должен сказать, и, значит, начало я обрываю, вот портрет показал, а вот эти все его разговоры, вступления оторвал, и концовку оторвал, где Торнхилл переходит, свою мистику, свою эзотерику, я уже все это убираю. Он длинный там, я не помню сколько, часа полтора, наверное, он говорит, а я поменьше сделал.
Wal, it's an honor to have you on the show here with us at the Leak Project. You've got a beautiful website, actually 2 websites that are really nice. I love your YouTube channel. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd recommend going to thunderbolts.info. Got a plethora of intel. How the heck are you?
I'm fine. Thanks, Rex. Thanks for the call.
Absolutely. It's just an honor to speak with you. I am not well versed in the electric universe. I've heard a little bit of that theory before, and it certainly makes a lot of sense. With the little that I do know about it, I can definitely relate. If you would, for our audience, tell them a little bit about yourself, and then we'll segue into your work.
Okay. It's not unusual that people don't know much about the electric universe because, of course, all of our cosmology at present completely ignores electricity. You won't find it in any index or in any glossy book on the Big Bang, which is quite odd when you think about it, because all of the matter that we are made up of and the Earth's made up and stars are made up from are all made up of charged particles. And the basic idea of the electric universe is that if you try and apply a simple repeated pattern, both downwards into the subatomic particles and also up to galaxies, you can see repeated patterns and ones which are easy to identify once you allow electricity to enter into the discussion. The way I came to this was perhaps a little odd, but a great number of people I've found know about Velikovsky and his book Worlds in Collision, which was a bestseller in 1950 for months on end. That is until the Harvard mafia managed to have the publisher, Macmillan, a technical book publisher, burn the books and hand it over to a popular publisher, Doubleday. So book burning still occurs, and it gives you an idea that cosmology and this trying to understand how we fit in the universe is more of a religious pursuit than a scientific one in most instances. Now, what Velikovsky did was to take a forensic approach to all of the most ancient information that he could get hold of from around the world, and came to certain conclusions about the recent history of the solar system. Now, of course, we're told this bedtime story about how the solar system was created about 4.5 billion years ago. And of course, when you push things that far back in time, you can make up any story you like.
Exactly.
And the interesting thing is, of course, that the theory just doesn't work. You know, I attend meetings by professional astronomers here in Canberra, and an expert on planet formation theory and the formation of the solar system admitted that you needed a different theory for every planet. The solar system is a complete fruit salad of objects. There is no real gradation from the sun outwards, which is what you'd expect if the planets are just formed from the leftovers. And when I mentioned the solar system, of course, now we've got over 3,500 exoplanetary systems that have been discovered over recent years, and we appear to be an odd one out because the exoplanetary systems throw up even more mysteries and throw into doubt this bedtime story, once upon a time 4.5 billion years ago. So the thing that Velikovsky did was he threw down a gauntlet to astronomers, and they didn't bother to pick it up. They just got up in the pulpit and said, no, it disobeys Newton's laws. But you've got to remember that all of these so-called laws are man-made, and they're generally restricted to a view which is what they call geocentric. In other words, our conditions on Earth are extrapolated out into the galaxies as if we can do that without any consequences. And of course you can't, because when you look at galaxies, they don't behave according to Newton's law. So just extrapolating Newton's law out into deep space doesn't work, which should have provided some sense of humility in the astronomers. But rather than that, no, they just discarded what Velikovsky had discovered, and that was that Venus was recognized globally by all ancient cultures as having been the archetypal comet, the doomsday comet, which means that Venus is a new addition to the solar system, if you like. So the solar system does have a recent history, and the old bedtime story is just that. It's a fairy story. The electric universe grew out of trying to explain how you could have an object within human memory on a cometary orbit now having the most circular orbit in the solar system. And Velikovsky felt that electricity and magnetism played a principal role in providing this clockwork regularity that we see today. And it's taken me a lifetime to come to a satisfactory conclusion with the help, with the help of a lot of people who have been marginalised over the years for coming up with so-called outrageous ideas. Sometimes the truth is more outrageous than anything anyone can dream up as a fiction story. And the electric universe certainly fits that category. However, the test of any good theory is, does it successfully predict and also explain new discoveries without inventing new forces, new particles, new fudge factors at every turn? The electric universe has been able to accommodate all of the findings in recent years, both from space and in particle physics. It can accommodate them quite easily simply by painting a picture of our real place in the universe. And that's what the electric universe is all about.
Well, I'm thinking about how if everything breaks down to a vibrational frequency, I guess that's a form of electricity in a sense?
Well, the connection between all matter is electrical. Fundamentally, it's all electrical. You know, an atom holds together because the electrons are drawn towards the protons in the nucleus. And in galaxies, it's quite easy to show, and in fact it's been done with peer-reviewed research in Electrical Engineering Journal, that galaxies are effectively very simple electric motors. They're Faraday motors. And then that raises the question, where does the energy come to turn these motors? Where is the electrical energy coming from? And the simple answer is we don't know, except that you can trace the power lines with radio telescopes. The problem is, of course, that because cosmology is more of a religious pursuit and it's driven by beliefs, no one has yet been able to let go of the idea that the magnetic fields that we see everywhere in space somehow are just magically there, when we all know, electrical engineers know in particular, that magnetism requires an electric current or electric motion of particles to generate them.
Well, you said that earlier that the universe, you brought up the 4 billion year old mark, because a lot of scientists say 4 billion, I've heard 6, 7, etc. How old is the universe?
Well, we're talking there, or I was talking about the age of the solar system, which is estimated at 4.5 billion years. However, all of these estimates are based on stories that were made up at the beginning of the 20th century. And the basic problem they faced then was, how do you keep the sun burning long enough to produce all of the erosion and all of the sculpting we see on the Earth? You know, if you the 4.5 billion years refers to the age of the solar system. In other words, that's supposed to be the age of the Earth. But all of these estimates of ages are based on the bedtime story. And the bedtime story was developed at the beginning of the 20th century to answer how the sun could burn for 4.5 billion years, because at that stage the geologists had said it would take hundreds of millions, maybe even 1,000 million years or 1 billion years for some of these features we see on Earth to have had time to form. If you assume that the forces we see in action today are the only forces that have ever acted on the Earth, which is a pretty rash assumption. So when nuclear energy came along, of course, they suddenly said, we found an energy source that could last for that length of time. But of course, Then Eddington, who gave us the standard model of the interior of the sun, had the sheer arrogance to say it should not be too difficult to understand something as simple as a star, which was based on the idea that you have just a ball of hydrogen and helium self-gravitating, and somehow or another it forms enough pressure and heat in the centre to start nuclear reactions. Now, all of this was just sheer conjecture. We're unable to repeat the hypothesized nuclear reactions in any laboratory on Earth to test that idea. And, of course, one of the greatest bits of evidence against this idea that somehow the sun is up there just trying to shed itself of internal energy is when you look at sunspots. That's a region of the bright photosphere that's been pushed aside, and you can see much deeper, and it's dark down there. It's cooler, which suggests that whatever is inside is not trying to release energy out into space, and that whatever a star is something reacting to its environment. And this is one of the aspects of the electric universe that's very important, because we propose that stars are an electrical discharge phenomenon primarily. Of course, nuclear reactions are taking place, but they are mediated by electrical power coming in from deep space. And this also can be tested by radio telescopes, and there's one radio astronomer in particular, Gerrit Verschuur, who has shown pretty definitively that the magnetic fields you can trace in space are actually showing us the local wiring of the circuit, if you like. And you can do the same for galaxies and also see the wiring circuits for galaxies. It's a completely electrical picture. And, of course, once you have stars that are powered externally, there is no standard evolutionary story of stars and their ages. A star is a child of its environment. It is not subject to gradually consuming itself. This is an interesting and a completely different way of looking at the universe. It's a way of looking at it as a connected whole. You know, we're all part of this gigantic circuitry. And, of course, the evidence for that also is in these pictures you see of the shape of the galaxy, and it's all made up of very fine filaments, all streaking around. Now, gravity doesn't form filaments naturally. It forms spherical objects because gravity always is a radial force. But electric currents flowing in space are filamentary, just like you see in those little novelty plasma balls. And they're also dynamic. They move. And that also is an important feature.
So when you see different types of stars, whether it be a brown dwarf, I've seen the official version of stars, and you've got the ones that have lived their life supposedly, and now they're just basically roaming in space at not nearly the heat. And then you've got some that go hypernova, etc. And if you look at our own sun right now, it seems different than it was 20 years ago. But I think that just has to do with the geoengineering.
Yes, well, that's another aspect. When I said earlier that each planet in the solar system needs a different theory, each different type of star has a different theory to explain it. And it's very complicated and has a huge number of fudge factors, which means that virtually it's unfalsifiable. So you can make up a story, and if it doesn't fit, you just add a few more knobs to twiddle, and you'll have a new story with new forces, new particles, new reactions, whatever. In other words, it's a complication rather than a simplification, which was the aim of classical science before it went off the rails at the beginning of the 20th century.
Okay.
The electric universe explains all stars as variations on the low-pressure gas discharge model. And we're actually testing that model in an experiment called the SAPPHIRE experiment, which you can see information about that on the thunderbolts.info website. And if that, we've already done phase 1, and that was very promising, the results from that. Now we're doing phase 2, which is a much bigger, scaled-up version of the experiment. And if that turns out the way I expect, it means that's the end of stellar physics as we know it now. And it will also mean that we will understand our own star better. We'll understand how we are caught up in the sun's circuit, and therefore our weather, our climate, and all of that kind of stuff is driven by that circuit, which gives you some idea that the scaremongering for climate change is misguided. The climate changes. It's not under our control. And what we need to do is to find ways of ameliorating any effects that happen to disturb us, like getting too warm or getting too cold. And we're just as likely to get too cold as we are to get too warm. And the geological record shows that this is the kind of thing that's happened in the past. I think the best thing that can be said about the climate change people is that at least they're trying to clean up our act, because we have a very bad habit of messing in our own nest.
Absolutely. And definitely the media likes to push two sides of extremes. You know, they make it look as if you have one of two choices. You can either join the side on the right that says humans have absolutely nothing to do with anything on the earth changes, and then you have the exact opposite of that. And if you go back 100 years in big cities where they had to, you know, basically burn a lot of coal and other things, I mean, it's going to affect the atmosphere and the air that you're breathing. Just look at certain places in China when those big giant corporations and industries building those computer parts and toxic stuff, etc. Yet, as far as the global scheme of things, like you're saying, that's connected at a level to where it's not going to be something that you and I can have a really big impact on, if any at all. So now you do see chemtrails out there today in geoengineering, and I'm not referring to the contrails. There's definitely two different things, and whether you want to pitch that, whether they pitch that to the powers that be as to create a cooling type effect or make clouds so it would cool the earth, I don't know, but it doesn't seem to be helping. I mean, it seems like the sun is more intense now than it used to be. Am I off on that? Have you noticed that at all? Or
the solar activity has changed, and any change in the sun will have an effect on our climate, even though the output of the sun remains fairly steady in terms of heat and light. One of the aspects of the electrical model of the sun and other stars, other bright stars, is that the photosphere acts like a transistor and controls the heat and light output. But if you look at the sun in X-rays, our sun is a variable star. And the X-ray input is actually a gauge of whether you're going to see sunspots or not. So the two go hand in hand in some respects. And that means because the Earth and all of the planets are caught up in the sun's circuit, we get some of the after effects. And that can mean changes in the climate. And in the past, when we've had very few sunspots for an extended period of time, we have had a mini ice age, they called it. So we could be heading to cold rather than heat. To say that we are responsible for warming the Earth denies the geological evidence as well, which shows that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere follows the change in temperature. It doesn't precede it.
Right.
So the electric universe is really a more holistic way of looking at science. That's why I call my website Holo Science, because it's a holistic covers all different aspects of our existence and all different disciplines. In fact, one of the problems with science today is the specialization, because you have experts in one field who mislead experts in other fields, and generally there's a reluctance to tread on the toes of anyone in another field, so you keep quiet, even though you may have misgivings about the information you're being given. So there is a tendency for experts in one field to experiment on us and the Earth based on total ignorance of other areas of science which should be considered. That's particularly in the area of bioengineering and the Earth, based on total ignorance of other areas of science which should be considered. That's particularly in the area of bioengineering and that kind of thing, where we don't understand life yet, but we're quite happy to tinker genetically with plants and animals.
We can't figure it out. Let's just blow it up.
Yeah, that's right. We've had a bad habit of doing that. I mean, even the first attempts to produce nuclear fission, the experimenters there were, holding 2 bits of uranium-235 in their hands and bring them together and watch it flash. And then they wondered why they died shortly after. It was this kind of playing with fire, which we have a tendency to do. Yeah. And one of the things about the electric universe is that it brings all of these various disciplines, it knocks down the barriers, even between the sciences and the arts, because Velikovsky showed that the arts and the history of ancient peoples has a heck of a lot to teach us about our real situation in the universe. And it's fascinating.
Yeah, I'd definitely like to get into that in a moment. One other question I'd like to ask before that, though, is what about shooting stars and black holes? I guess that's 2 questions.
Well, the shooting stars are just fragments of the planetary fragments that have been lofted into space by interplanetary discharges, and we'll talk a lot about that later. The black holes are what you get when you just use mathematics to try and explain what's going on in a galaxy, which is an electric motor, using gravity, which is so weak that even a tiny magnet can lift matter away from the 6 sextillion tons of the Earth. Gravity is so weak a force that if you want to do the things that are required to hold a galaxy together gravitationally, you have to postulate something which is almost infinitely dense and infinitely massive. And once you involve infinities, you are no longer doing physics, because infinity is not a number, it's just a concept. You don't need black holes in the electric universe simply because as plasma physicists and electrical engineers who've worked in plasma experiments know, there's a very simple device which has got 2 concentric cylinders, and you initiate a high voltage discharge between those 2 cylinders. And what happens is you get this radial streamers, equally spaced, racing down the 2 cylinders until it reaches the other end. It balloons out beyond the cylinders, and then it collapses back into the very center of the 2 of those cylinders and forms a tiny donut. Now, you can concentrate all of the energy of a room full of capacitors, and that's a colossal amount of energy, into something which is a millimeter or so across and shaped like a tiny donut. And that stores all of that electromagnetic energy. Now, E equals mc squared says if you've got a lot of energy in a tiny space, then it appears like a lot of mass. But the behavior of galaxies, too, is not explained gravitationally by black holes, because what you see are active galaxies spewing material out along the axis, the rotational axis. And this is a feature of these plasma gun experiments, where the little plasmoid, the little donut, finally gets so intense it decays, the particles start to collide with one another, and it shoots beams of neutrons and radiation out along the axis. So the electrical engineers are the people who should be doing cosmology these days, and the mathematicians should be retired to the back room where they belong, because even the mathematics of black holes is nonsense. The space that Newton worked with is the space we recognize. That is 3 dimensions, it's flat. You can superimpose a star and planets in your model and it all works. You can superimpose as many objects as you like and the theory still works. A black hole, you've seen those illustrations in books and shown on television ad nauseum.
Oh, yeah.
Where you see that funnel shape with a sun or star at the bottom and the Earth is perched somewhere up on the funnel. That is an example of the shape of the space that a black hole occupies. And that space, which is called asymptotically flat, cannot be superimposed on a flat space or on another asymptotically flat space. So you cannot have any other object in the universe but a black hole. Mathematically, it doesn't work to put another black hole there. So the idea that these gravitational waves that are recently so-called discovered was due to two coalescing black holes is sheer nonsense, mathematically and physically.
Do you think wormholes are possible?
No. You can't warp space. I mean, space is a concept of 3 dimensions. If you go adding another dimension, just point me in that direction, because it has to have direction, and you have to be able to measure it with a ruler. Otherwise, it's not a dimension. This is one of the problems with mathematics. They say mathematics is the language of science. No, it's not. Unless you can describe each of the symbols on that blackboard in real physical terms, in flat space, and with no messing around with time, then you do not have any understanding of it. So even E equals mc squared, the equation best known to the public, is not understood by scientists because they have no definition for energy or mass in terms of the structure of matter. You won't find a definition in any textbook or encyclopedia, simply because there is none. So our physics today has been taken over by people who are not suited or trained actually to do science. Mathematics is a different discipline. It's more like learning how to be a champion chess player than it is to actually understand the universe.
Okay. And if I could ask this, I'm trying to grasp why it has to be a flat universe.
Simply because the mathematics of Newton's theory of gravity requires a flat space for you to be able to, say, put the Earth in orbit around the Sun, because otherwise the equations are meaningless if you try and substitute a body which is only exists in a different shape space. But to talk of different shape spaces is beyond our comprehension anyway, which means that we are talking figuratively, when we talk about warp space, and it's really meaningless because there is no explanation in this warp space idea to explain why a body should move, because warp space can't exert a force. So the Earth perched on that funnel edge, or somewhere down the funnel, has no reason for it to move in any direction at all. It can just sit there. So the theory of the mathematical theories are generally divorced from anything real physically. Now, mathematics, of course, is very valuable once you have a really good physical model to underpin it. That's when you're doing real science. But the mathematicians should not be the ones making statements about what their mathematics means. It requires what they used to call in the old days the natural philosophers and the experimental physicists, the ones like Faraday. We've more or less lost the plot. It's become, instead of after the Second World War, they used to say that science had become shut up and calculate. With the advent of computers, it's become shut up and simulate. And we all know how easy it is for computers nowadays to generate a virtual reality that looks real on the big screen, but which has no reality to underpin it. So we have more or less lost the way of doing science, which was the science of Faraday and Maxwell and people like that.
So if everything breaks down into the electric hypothesis, essentially, does that mean that there's a positive and negative discharge in everything, or there's opposites to each?
Of course, once you've established the model for the electric universe, there are still the big mysteries. How far down can you go with the structure of matter to explain the things that we observe? And if it's a repeated pattern, how many little orbiting systems of charge can you have within each particle? These are questions which remain for the future. And when you go up into the big scale, you notice that galaxies behave like electric motors, and they're also connected by these gigantic circuits. And, of course, this has been shown to fit with the discovery that the rotation axes of galaxies and that tend to be lined up, the rotation axes of, the rotation axes of quasars too, tend to be lined up over vast distances, which is what you'd expect if they're all strung out like beads on a string. Stars are formed like beads on a string. All of this is a repeated pattern, and it's easily explained electrically, but it has no explanation gravitationally. That may not have answered your question quite, but the electric universe simplifies things the way Faraday and the pioneers did, and that is they try and reduce the number of forces, reduce the number of particles, and come up with a simple model that explains everything we see using the least number of assumptions. The electric universe shows that the electric force is the only force you need to explain gravity, magnetism, the nuclear force, and so on. Magnetism and gravity turn out to be what happens when you have neutral matter, which is made up of negative and positive charge, but the positive charge is slightly offset from the negative charge in such a way that you form what are known as electric dipoles, like little magnets. And, of course, magnetism is an electric dipolar force. That's why you can't have a monopole. They keep searching for these things like searching for the Holy Grail, but you won't find one because magnetism is an electric dipole force. The same for gravity, and that has huge repercussions for our understanding of the sun and the planets, because what happens is that once a body is formed by powerful electromagnetic forces in these molecular clouds, like beads on a string, both planets and stars are formed in the same process. And once the discharge moves on, because as you know in the little plasma ball, these filaments move around, and it's recently been discovered that the stars get left behind, but the stars are moving, scattered like buckshot, I think was the term the plasma physicists used, and they capture one another. And this is why the exoplanetary systems look quite crazy. You know, they've got planets orbiting over the poles of a star and orbiting backwards and all sorts of strange things. So it's the electrical forces that create these bodies in the first instance, and once they're formed, all of the atoms within that body, the nuclei, are 2,000 times heavier, or the particles, the protons and the neutrons that make up the nucleus of an atom, are 2,000 times more massive than the electrons that are in orbit around those nuclei. So that in a gravitational field, which you cannot shield from, the nuclei will drift towards the centre of the Earth, which means that they will be offset slightly within each atom, slightly offset towards the inside of the Earth. That means that each atom looks like a tiny little electric dipole, or looks like a magnet, if you like, with the positive pole facing inwards and the negative pole facing outwards, which means that all bodies in the universe have the same polarity facing outwards. They tend to repel one another, which means that Newton's law of gravity works when you're standing on the Earth, because we're attracted to it like an iron filing is to a magnet. It doesn't care whether it's the North or South Pole. It'll be attracted equally to the nearest one that's more powerful. But once you get away from the Earth, the Moon will have the same pole facing the Earth. The Earth will be repelling the Sun will be repelling the planets. So you say, well, what holds it all together? And the answer is all of the matter in the rest of the universe. And this theory was actually put forward by a colleague of Newton. So even Sir Isaac Newton considered this idea as a possibility, and it works. The same equation works. And it also raises a very interesting issue, and that is that it means you don't need a Big Bang for the universe to be stable. the problem with gravity being only an attractive force is that you have somehow to separate all the matter in an initial creation event, whatever that was, and then afterwards it will try and all fall back to where it came from. Just like, you toss something into the air and it'll fall back to Earth. However, if you look at gravity as being like a magnet, then you face the same poles of two magnets together and try and push them together. You can feel that force that avoids, it avoids them coming together. So this explains why the universe, which was shown by Helton Arp, the astronomer, who worked with Hubble, he showed definitively from his observational research, which is more important than theoretical sitting in front of a computer research, that the universe appears to be stable, static, not expanding. And he himself said that the only answer to this is if somehow gravity is repulsive on the large scale. So this paints a completely different picture. Helton Arp's work was accepted by Sir Fred Hoyle and Margaret and Geoffrey Burbage, the astronomers, and a number of other well-versed astronomers based on his observational work. But the theorists didn't want a bar of it, so they used statistics to try and discredit Helton Arp's work. Unfortunately, Helton Arp died last year, I think it was, which is very sad because he is of the stature of any of the giants of the past, in my opinion. In fact, a lot of people who knew of him called him the modern-day Galileo.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you about also is you brought up Venus earlier and how the ancient people looked at it like it was a comet that was going to end the world, and that's basically making me think about Nibiru and Planet X and all the hysteria that's going on with that anomaly, that planet. So talk to us about how that would explain the electric universe. Did it attract it somehow? I mean, did the different planet or something attract Venus into this solar system essentially?
No, the story of the recent history of the solar system involves the capture by the sun of a brown dwarf and its entourage of satellites, or planets, if you like. And it requires a complete, you have to come to it with a beginner's mind, because if you start sitting there thinking up objections, you will miss all of the aspects of the story that make it coherent and plausible. The first thing to understand is that a comet is a body that is electrically discharging because it's traveling from one part of the solar system, the outer solar system, towards the inner solar system. And as it comes into the inner solar system, it's speeding up until it whips around the sun. Now, as you move through the solar plasma, which surrounds the sun right out to the boundary with the interstellar space, you are entering regions where the voltage is changing slightly. Now, it only has to be millivolts per kilometre, and it adds up to a substantial voltage over the traverse from the outer solar system to in nearer the sun. And what happens is that the body itself begins to try and establish equilibrium with its environment. And in doing so, it begins to discharge. And the first visual evidence is the production of a coma, as they call it, which is what's known as a plasma sheath. And that plasma sheath can be huge. In fact, I forget which comet it was, a recent one, the big spherical coma was as big as the sun. It gives you some idea. Which shows that it's an electrical event and nothing to do with a little piece of rock, maybe a kilometre or two across. There's no way that gravity could handle something the size of the sun and attach it to a body a couple of kilometres across. But electrically, the forces involved are able to do that quite easily. Now, as it gets in closer to the sun, the discharge, the voltage at the surface can be sufficient to start stripping electrons from the surface, and that will strip atoms as well. And that's what we've been observing. Of course, minerals, rocky minerals, have oxygen in them, and oxygen atoms are stripped off. They combine with the hydrogen from the solar wind, and you get what's called the OH radical. And that's what's measured, and it's decided that is water coming from the comet. It's not. It's a bit of the plasma chemistry that goes on surrounding a discharging body in the solar system. Okay, that's a bit complicated maybe, but a comet is a giant electrical discharging body. Now, in the process of discharging, it's also altering the mass and the gravity of that object in such a way that it's circularizing the orbit. And this is why Venus today has the most circular orbit. And just last month or so, astronomers expressed surprise to find that electrons are still leaving Venus 5 times more strongly than they are leaving the Earth, and stripping oxygen atoms off Venus still. So this gives you a good idea that the cometary discharge model is correct. So Venus established a circular orbit quite rapidly, but in the process, of course, it was passing near the Earth and Mars and creating a certain amount of havoc. So all of the ancient stories of the planetary gods, Mars and Venus and so on, have aspects of them which refer to what was witnessed by the ancients. In fact, Mars, with that colossal gash that runs a third of the way around the planet, and called Valles Marineris, is one of those scars. And the North American Indians, the name for Mars was Scarface. The Homeric story of Achilles being wounded in the heel, in other words, being scarred, also is a kind of reference to that. So mankind actually witnessed the...
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, isn't it also called Mars is referred to as the god of war?
Yes, that's right. Because it seemed to be involved in exchanges with Venus and the Earth. Mars with its sword. The sword itself is a symbol of the electrical discharge that was seen emanating from Mars. Because it's not like normal lightning. In space, when you, in that very thin plasma, it takes a different form. And it can be quite complicated at times. And it was a big breakthrough in 2000 when we had an expert in high-energy plasma discharge phenomena come to our conference. And he was absolutely blown away when he saw the imagery we were showing. He said, this is classified information. He said, this fits the images we get on X-rays with an X-ray telescope when we perform these experiments where we funnel more energy than all the power stations on Earth into something the size of a baked bean tin, and we stand about 1 kilometre away looking at it through a telescope. These are the forms that we see, and that really changed his life, because he then instituted a search around the world and with a lot of volunteers to document the rock carvings and their GPS positions and the pictures of the horizon. His aim was to recreate in 3D the motion of this apparition in the sky in the past. I'm sure it would make a fantastic IMAX movie one day when somebody has the courage to do it.
Absolutely. And that makes me wonder also about the Grand Canyon. I've heard the hypothesis of that was actually caused by some electric discharge of other planets. And then you think about the possibility of, if planets are causing all of this chaos and stuff like that, does that relate to the Greek pantheos and the different mythos of the Sumerian tablets, the Greek gods, etc.?
Yes. Yeah.
Let's get into that.
David Talbot says there was a myth-making era, and it was unique. There was nothing like it happened afterwards. It was a period of mankind's history that was completely beyond our modern experience. And of course, this creates a problem for the mathematicians because they like to be able to retro-calculate. But of course, if the solar system only has a history as we see it today, going back, say, 12 to 20,000 years, then, all bets are off. You can't retro-calculate what happened on Earth beyond that sort of timescale. And unfortunately, this creates a problem for geologists because their descriptive science only became a hard science when they started putting dates on things. But those dates are generally retro-calculated and based on the idea that the Earth has not been seriously disturbed over all of that time. And there is no evidence that that's the case. In fact, the evidence is diametrically opposed to that.
Do you think that there could be a possibility that because of the way the world turns and the electric universe, that there could be this kind of attraction of we could pull in another planet or something and there could be more chaos in the future like there was many years ago?
What happened all those thousands of years ago was the entry of a brown dwarf into the solar system. And, of course, the stars being an electrical phenomenon, when you get a dwarf star, and when I say dwarf, they're only dwarfs because astronomers equate brightness with, or luminosity with the mass of an object, and therefore when brown dwarfs were shown to have quite low luminosity, it was said, they must be low mass and therefore they'd be quite small. They'd appear small. But that's not the case. In an electric discharge, when a body is trying to gather more charge from a very rare gas or rarefied gas, the electrode, the surface of the body, the discharge begins to leave the body and expands to gather enough charge. It's a little complicated to explain. It really needs a diagram. But what that means is that a brown dwarf is a planetary-sized object inside a vast envelope which is glowing because it's accepting electrical energy from its surroundings. If, for instance, Jupiter were to become a brown dwarf, and it probably was in its earlier history, and you lit up its present magnetosphere, it would appear when it's in opposition to be as big as the sun. So when you talk about these brown dwarfs, they are not, if we ever get to see one up close, they're not dwarfs at all. And if you think about Jupiter, if its magnetosphere was lit up, well, the inner moons, the Galilean moons, would be orbiting within the star, if you like. We wouldn't be able to see them. We may see their movement as kind of star spots, if you like, on that red glowing envelope. But in the electric universe, that is the place where you're most likely to find life because you have all of the conditions you would wish. Instead of being in a narrow Goldilocks zone, which is a pretty unsafe place to be, like we are today, you are sitting in what is more like a cosmic womb, which is being lit equally on every square metre of the body. It doesn't matter how you're spinning or how your axis is oriented. You'll receive the same energy over the whole body. The light that falls on each body will be concentrated in the red and infrared, which is ideal for photosynthesis. And the corollary of that is, of course, that this plasma envelope will not let radio waves through. It would act like a metal reflector. So it would suggest that the SETI experiment, looking for life in the universe.
Все. Нет смысла дальше крутить. У него, видите, тема изменилась, от физики ушел. Надо было давно уже заканчивать эту ролик. Наверное, перекрутил. Ну, в общем, конец КП 85. Прощаюсь.